When dealing with nihilism and the symptoms of it, one of the ideas we can extrapolate from understanding it is how closely it's related to not just an intellectual conundrum, but an actual form of foolishness and idiocy. Because when we deal with extremes like nihilism, what we're dealing with is a negation of a part of the mind itself, a part of the rational mind that orders the world into a mental paradigm that at least is conducive to survival and self preservation. And because when the mind becomes trapped in its own intellectual confines, unable to escape from its own psychological trifles, then it begins to abandon basic needs of health, health of mind and body. And now, in this case, the subject is consciousness. And consciousness carries with it its own demands of survival and its own health. One of those necessities, one of those demands is a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, or even a sensation of a drive towards something. We can consider consciousness the primordial intuitive apparatus where it manifests self consciousness. Self is the awareness of the suffering, of consciousness, of the existent. So it becomes aware of the nodal point of being that was already there, that which was already present in oneself. And so it's very much like being born, born into suffering through this awareness, born into the negative of existence that seeks to exploit you and draw energy from you against your will. Now, in order for the self to survive in consciousness, it must have a will, a striving towards value and objectivity. This is its survival mechanism, which nihilism subverts. And so, in the play Waiting for Godot, we find about all we can ever hope for in terms of understanding what nihilism is, because the entire play's theme is structured on nihilism. And so we have these two main protagonists, two men lost vagabonds, these rootless vagrants, who find themselves in some form of an existential purgatory, ideally of their own making, although they're too dumb to figure this out. And part of their problem is that they are not only lost in the world, but they're also stupid and unable to understand why, which only exacerbates their situation, right? And so, as they wait for this imaginary entity named Godot, who is a symbolic allusion to God, which I'll touch more upon later, who will supposedly come along and save them from themselves, from their suffering. So, in the meantime, they do everything they can to escape their suffering, to escape themselves, until the final respite of their salvation. They have to do something, though, moment for moment, to pass the time while they wait. And of course, being stuck together, the only thing they can think to do is torment each other with mindless conversation. And it is this constant conversation that they endlessly engage in that is part of the mental conundrum of nihilism that they're trapped in. This nihilistic subjectivism, that nothing being said means anything, and that it's all forgotten anyway. And so there's no awareness of oneself or the burden of facing the meaning of anything, as long as they make sure to keep themselves occupied with words and verbosity. So they're trapped in an indecisive, inactive inertia of the mind, with no reference outside of it, and anything outside of it is considered an absurdity anyway. And so the play it's very tedious most of the time, because all you're doing is listening to these two idiots banter at each other in senseless chattering. And part of this is to show that man chooses to be a victim of his own nature, and he will do anything to escape from himself in any way he can. A man can never be at peace, nor can he take himself seriously, because all he does is remain caught in a linguistic net he can't fight his way out of. But he'll do anything to detach himself from the world through these distractions, through theories, through fantasies and banalities, so he can lose himself in himself, lose himself into the primal state of consciousness, where he's just this animal, helpless to his own thoughts and impulses, at the mercy of cosmic chaos, lacking any drive towards anything. So we can see how this play captures the essence of man's nihilism through this intellectual method of self-denial. Total self-abdication by surrendering to the whims of his own suffering without ever becoming aware of why he suffers. So these two clowns, and we have to refer to them as that because that's what they are, they mention to themselves in the play about committing suicide, and they do it once in the beginning and another time at the end. And they talk about hanging themselves on this naked and nearly lifeless tree that is the only sign of any living natural thing other than them. And the fact that all they can do is think about this one singular natural thing, this growing living thing, the only form of life in their emptiness, in a way as to how it would serve them in committing suicide, is endlessly tragic, because that's all they see the world as an end to their suffering, because they're too helpless and weak to create or overcome anything. And so they wallow in their helplessness, trying to reason with themselves, giving themselves therapy as to why nothing matters. And the phrase nothing to be done is said multiple times in their dialogue, as if to reiterate some justification to their plight, that maybe if they acknowledge the meaninglessness of the world, then that will be their form of value. And as the play progresses, you begin to grow to actually hate these two idiots, not because of how stupid they are, but because of how annoying and powerless they are. And you find yourself rooting for them to just kill themselves so you can hear your own thoughts as a viewer, and so that they can finally shut up. Now, two other vagabonds, vagrants, eventually cross paths with them at some point in the play. And one of these vagrants gives them this memorable monologue, which is meant to encapsulate the absurdity of the world and their situation. He's a deranged lunatic, and he proselytizes this long speech that is complete gibberish and senseless. But it also happens to have some little grains of truth in it here and there, so as to make it sound as if he's saying something prophetic or insightful. But the speech itself is basically gibberish, and we're supposed to believe that there was some mystical form of truth in it hidden in its gibberish, and this is not is this not what the modern intellectual landscape is? Wandering minds, spouting nonsense, and dressing it up in obscure language? Because that's the nature of this character's speech in this scene in the play, is to make a mockery of man's mind. That everything that goes on in his mind is totally meaningless. His language is meaningless. And so the nature of language itself has no value. It's just made into another fabrication, another distraction that the two clowns use to pass the time. And they learn nothing from it. It was just another random event that took place, right? And the whole point is to learn nothing, to think about nothing. Again, the whole play is about how man evades from self-consciousness and how the self is something without any value, just like the world. Nietzsche's eternal recurrence does find its way into this play. The meaning of it is how man finds himself in exactly this kind of nihilistic conundrum of repeating existence where he's caught in a cosmic flux, a particle being carried along in the repeating cycles of time and creation. And man himself is a repetition of a cycle of existence that he essentially has no control over, because existence is the determinate factor that he must learn to use to determine himself in relation to it. For the Nietzschean understanding is for man to use the fluctuating void to affirm life and meaning as the inspiration toward creation, and that self-consciousness is actually the objectification of oneself in the world, which absolves oneself of this conundrum into a productive mode of being, And this play takes the idea of eternal recurrence literally, where nihilism instead is the affirmation of itself. The will to nothing is the prime mover. And this speaks to the spiritual state of postmodernism, where truth has no reference to anything outside the mind. And so pure subjectivism makes the world an abstracted construct, malleable, and with no identity to the external. Thus, everything becomes absurd. Man becomes content to find affirmation in entropy and self-destruction. Though he makes a principle out of it, a value system out of it. The play is really a drama about the helplessness of man and how he chooses the value of his own inferiority, his own degradation. And so, in a way, these two clowns represent Nietzsche's last man, and that they strive toward nothing. They desire nothing, and take pride in languishing in self-pity and their powerlessness over their own fate. And this Godot symbolizes the absurd version of God because he never shows up, he never comes to save them from themselves. He never comes because he doesn't exist. And it's made clear in the play by this messenger in the form of a child when one of the characters inquires as to Godot's identity and what he does exactly. And the little boy responds by saying that he does, quote, nothing. Well, he does nothing because he is nothing. And so this is modern man's version of God, that which can be anything his mind invents, and also that which has no inherent meaning and can therefore be denied to suit his comforts or grievances. As cynical and godless as the characters are in the play, they still cling to a belief in God, which is ironic, and it's represented by the biblical references in the dialogue throughout the play. But the form of God as it is in his own ephemeral ego and spiritual impoverishment and decadence, God with no power, is modern man. And he still needs to have a reassurance that something is in control of him because he's too weak to exert any control over himself, right? And so man creates a nihilistic value of self-negation that he justifies by his own weakness to overcome it. And so weakness then becomes strength. So these two clowns learn that yet again Godot is not coming. And they talk about hanging themselves from the tree once again, demonstrating that they learned nothing about any events that took place or anything that they talked about. And it really is exemplary of how the nihilistic mind is a mind of absolute idiocy, which hides itself in existential cynicism, and that having no power or control over one's fate and being at the mercy of time and existence means to also have no power over one's mind, and to find a certain quality in being oblivious and clueless and a dunce who can't even figure out how to kill himself because he's trapped in his own linguistic abstract confusion. He can't figure out existence, why he's in it. Now, if one should take anything positive about something like this, and anything that's similar to it, is that the suffering of consciousness is to take on the duty to produce something, to produce meaning, to create, to face nature as it is, and as it must be, and then to understand how one can use that which is pathetic, decadent, and base, only as a way to affirm even more life and existence in the face of it. The complete rejection of these ugly nihilistic messages, at the very least, is a more dignified form to live.